March 5th, 1941, 14:07 p.m. A sharp Pacific wind swept across the dirt runway as a battered U.S. fighter limped to a stop, its prop still winding down with a metallic groan. The moment the wheels settled, crew chiefs jogged toward it, then froze. A gaping, jagged hole tore through the fuselage, big enough for daylight to punch straight into the cockpit. Wires hung loose. Steel ribs were peeled back like someone had ripped the skin off the aircraft with their bare hands. The canopy slid open. A 5-year-old pilot, face streaked with sweat and soot, pulled himself out, boots thudding onto the ground. His breath steamed in the cool afternoon air. 3 pilots rushed in, leather jackets still zipped from their own patrol, staring in disbelief at the shredded metal. "There's no way you flew that back," one murmured, fingertips tracing the torn edge around the hole. The young pilot didn't answer. He simply looked up at the sky, the same patch of sky he'd fought for his life in 25 minutes earlier. Because up there, at 12,000 feet, nothing suggested he'd survive. His squadron had climbed to intercept a Japanese bomber group pushing toward the American outpost. But once the fight started, everything collapsed fast. The formation scattered. Radio calls overlapped. A burst of defensive fire had ripped open the exact wound they were now staring at. According to every flight manual printed before the war, a pilot in his situation had one option: break away, dive out, get home before the airframe failed. But that rule didn't apply anymore, not when 7 bombers were lining up to strike the outpost's fuel stores. He'd stayed. He'd done something no American instructor would have approved. Something Japanese pilots would later say they couldn't believe when they saw it. The crew around him didn't know the full story yet. They only knew the impossible. March 5th, 1941. He brought this wrecked machine home, after making 7 bombers fall in 25 minutes. The ground crew slowly circled the damaged fighter as the afternoon sun dimmed behind drifting Pacific clouds, casting long shadows across the runway that made the torn fuselage look even more brutal than when it first rolled in. Several mechanics knelt near the gaping hole, peering inside the exposed wiring while exchanging quiet remarks that carried the same disbelief reflected on every face nearby. The 5-year-old pilot watched them silently, his chest rising and falling with the leftover adrenaline still pulsing through him long after the engine had stopped shaking. Far down the airstrip, the squadron's flight commander strode toward the aircraft with a clipboard in hand, his boots striking the packed dirt in steady, deliberate steps that signaled both urgency and restrained shock. He paused beside the wrecked section, leaning in close enough for oil fumes to cling to his jacket as he inspected the twisted metal that had barely held the airplane together during its final desperate minutes in the air. His eyes moved from the shattered panel to the pilot's soot-streaked face, silently calculating how many seconds had stood between survival and disaster. The pilot finally exhaled a slow, shaky breath as he leaned one hand against the wing, feeling the warmth of the sun-baked metal mixing with the cold bite of torn aluminum edges under his fingertips. The cockpit behind him still smelled of burnt insulation and gunpowder residue, a vivid reminder of how violently the battle had erupted above the islands earlier that afternoon. He could still hear fragments of radio calls echoing in his memory, each one layered with the same rising tension that had pushed him to make a decision no manual had ever prepared him for. A crew chief pointed deeper into the fuselage, where several components were visibly shredded, explaining that one more direct hit would have severed the control cables entirely and sent the aircraft spiraling into the ocean before anyone could react. Another mechanic lifted a torn section of the inner panel, revealing scorch marks that traced a perfect arc across the remaining support beams, as if the blast had narrowly missed the pilot's legs by inches. Their voices remained steady, yet every sentence carried a subtle mix of awe and fear at how thin the margin of survival had truly been. A pair of junior pilots approached from the far end of the field, still wearing their flight goggles pushed up onto their helmets, clearly eager to know how the young pilot had managed to escape a sky filled with bombers and escort fighters. They exchanged hushed theories among themselves before falling quiet as they neared the aircraft, realizing that the truth seemed far stranger than anything they had imagined during their short walk across the runway. The pilot met their eyes for a moment, offering a brief nod that conveyed neither triumph nor confidence, only a tired acceptance of what he had been forced to do. The flight commander finally straightened his posture and closed his clipboard, his expression shifting from analytical focus to the deeper concern of someone who understood how quickly battles could unravel during the opening years of the war. He asked the pilot to recount every detail while the engine still ticked from residual heat, emphasizing that timing mattered because the smallest memory might later prove essential to understanding how the engagement shifted so drastically in such a short window. The pilot nodded again, swallowing hard before preparing to relive the moment when the sky erupted around him with tracer fire, smoke trails, and the unmistakable silhouettes of Japanese bombers cutting through the clouds. As the Pacific wind swept across the field once more, carrying dust along the edge of the runway, the pilot closed his eyes briefly and pictured the exact point where the formation appeared, the precise angle of their approach, and the critical instant when he realized that following standard doctrine would guarantee the loss of the outpost below. When he opened his eyes again, the commander was waiting patiently, pen poised, ready to capture every second of the battle that had nearly cost them the young pilot, now standing before him. And with the smell of burnt metal still clinging to the air, the story of those 25 minutes finally began. The pilot drew a slow breath before speaking, letting the memory settle as clearly as the smoky scent that still clung to his flight jacket. And when he finally began describing the moment everything unraveled, the ground crew leaned closer, as if the very air around them vibrated with the tension of his recollection. He explained how the sky had seemed deceptively calm seconds before the attack, with sunlight slicing through broken clouds and the distant hum of engines forming a steady rhythm that almost felt routine after weeks of patrol duty. That brief calm collapsed the instant his wingman shouted over the radio, warning of fast-moving silhouettes rising from the haze below, their formation expanding like a closing trap that offered no easy escape. The pilot described how overlapping voices filled his headset as each man tried to report the bomber's altitude, bearing, and speed, creating a chaotic wall of noise that made it nearly impossible to distinguish urgent commands from panicked reactions. Every cockpit in the squadron vibrated as engines were pushed to maximum power, yet the feeling of acceleration brought little reassurance as the enemy formation tightened with unnerving precision. He remembered glancing left to confirm his wingman's position, only to catch sight of tracer rounds, tearing across the sky in long streaks of red light that pierced the afternoon air with crackling intensity, forcing him to bank sharply before the volley chewed through his tail. That first evasive maneuver sent his instruments rattling and shifted loose objects inside the cockpit, adding to the sense of instability already building in his gut as the bombers grew larger with each passing second. Before he could steady the aircraft, another burst of defensive fire snapped across his nose, filling the canopy with flashes that forced him to flinch, even though he knew flinching would cost him precious visibility. The pilot explained how the tight confines of his cockpit suddenly felt smaller than they ever had before, pressing against his shoulders as vibrations shook the entire frame, and the oxygen mask pinched against his cheekbone whenever he leaned forward to track the nearest threat. He said the turbulence from the bomber's slipstream slammed into his fighter like invisible fists, jolting the aircraft hard enough to make the control stick twitch violently in his hands as he fought to maintain any semblance of stability. With every jolt, warning lights flickered across his instrument panel, their rapid blinking forming an unsettling counterpoint to the rising whine of the overstressed engine behind him. As the Japanese escorts closed in from above, their diving angles forced the pilot to react faster than his training usually demanded, prompting a series of split-second decisions that left no room for hesitation or second thoughts. He remembered hearing someone shout that they were losing altitude too quickly, yet the overlapping radio chatter made it impossible to identify who was speaking or whether the message even applied to his position. The chaotic swirl of voices, machine gun bursts, and engine strain created a suffocating atmosphere that left him with no option but to rely entirely on instinct, pushing aside every carefully memorized procedure drilled into him during pre-war training. The pilot described one moment in particular when a near miss sent shrapnel skittering across his canopy, scattering tiny sparks that danced like fireflies before disappearing into the rushing wind. For a brief heartbeat, he had been certain the next volley would find its mark, and yet he forced himself to stabilize the aircraft long enough to scan the bomber formation above, knowing that losing them for even a second would compromise the defense of the outpost below. Every muscle in his arms burned from the effort of holding the fighter steady, and his breath echoed sharply through the mask as the chaotic orchestra of battle intensified around him. By the time he reached this part of the story, the mechanics and pilots listening on the runway understood just how completely the sky had turned hostile around the young aviator. The chaos he described was not the frantic confusion of inexperience, but the overwhelming pressure of a battlefield where every sound, every vibration, and every flash of light demanded an immediate response. And in the heart of that storm, he realized he had only seconds to choose between survival and mission, a choice that would lead directly to the crazy move the Japanese pilots never saw coming. The pilot paused for a moment before shifting the story toward the rules he had been trained to follow, explaining that every maneuver drilled into him before the war revolved around caution, spacing, and strict formation integrity, all designed to prevent unnecessary losses during the chaotic first months of escalating conflict in the Pacific. He recalled how instructors emphasized maintaining altitude advantage whenever possible, reminding young aviators that control of height equaled control of initiative, a principle hammered into their minds through endless diagrams and blackboard lectures. The manuals insisted that attacking bomber formations required patience and coordination, not impulsive charges, because a single misjudged dive could place a pilot directly into concentrated defensive fire that would tear an aircraft apart in seconds. He described the exact checklist he had memorized, reciting it almost automatically, as if his body still remembered the cadence, even when his mind focused on survival during the battle. Formation alignment was always the first step, ensuring that every wingman held their assigned position to avoid collisions or overlapping fire, especially when preparing to intercept heavily guarded bombers. The next rule demanded a shallow approach from above and behind, allowing pilots to pick off targets while minimizing exposure to the deadly arcs of machine guns stationed in the bomber's dorsal and tail positions. Instructors hammered home that deviating from this controlled descent invited disaster, because steep dives concentrated too much momentum and limited the ability to break away safely once hostile fire intensified. He continued by explaining how every page of the training handbook warned against entering the narrow zones directly beneath bomber formations, describing them as lethal pockets, where multiple guns could converge from different angles to shred any aircraft foolish enough to wander inside. These warnings were repeated during ground school sessions, where young pilots watched grainy film reels demonstrating how quickly a fighter could be destroyed when caught in the crosshairs of coordinated defensive fire. To reinforce the lesson, instructors often repeated stories of promising aviators who ignored the guidelines during early war skirmishes and never returned to their squadrons. Cautionary tales meant to instill discipline and obedience rather than creativity or improvisation. The pilot noted that the Doctrine's emphasis on safety was understandable in calmer circumstances, yet entirely unrealistic when confronted with aggressive enemy formations that rarely behaved as predictably as the training scenarios suggested. He remembered his frustration during simulation drills when instructors dismissed unconventional maneuvers as reckless, insisting that stability, patience, and teamwork were the only acceptable methods for engaging bombers. These rigid expectations left little room for adaptation once actual combat revealed the unpredictable speed, coordination, and aggression of the Japanese units defending their lumbering but heavily armed bombers. Each real-world encounter exposed the limitations of doctrines crafted in classrooms and airfields far removed from the violent chaos unfolding across the Pacific. He explained that the final rule drilled into every trainee emphasized immediate withdrawal if significant structural damage occurred, particularly if a pilot suspected compromised control surfaces or partial engine failure. The reasoning behind this protocol was simple. Losing one aircraft was unfortunate, but losing a pilot was unacceptable, especially during a period when trained aviators were increasingly scarce, and replacements arrived more slowly than the growing threats demanded. The manuals stated clearly that the priority in such instances was survival, not heroics, and that disengagement protected both the individual and the mission by preserving future combat capability. As he recited these regulations, the young pilot standing beside the wrecked aircraft seemed almost distant, as though replaying each rule inside his mind while comparing them to the raw, unforgiving reality he had faced in the sky. The faces around him reflected the unspoken realization that none of those carefully crafted instructions had survived contact with the overwhelming force he encountered that afternoon. Every rule had been designed for a battlefield that no longer existed, replaced by a far more volatile environment where traditional doctrine provided little more than false reassurance. And in that moment of suffocating pressure, he understood that clinging to those textbook procedures would not only doom his mission, but almost certainly cost him his life, a realization that set the stage for everything he would do next. As the pilot continued his account, his voice settled into a calmer rhythm, allowing the deeper truth behind the failed doctrine to surface with a clarity that had eluded him during the frantic minutes of the engagement. He explained that the manuals assumed bomber groups would behave predictably, maintaining rigid formations that allowed American fighters to approach from safe angles without risking unnecessary exposure. Yet the Japanese units he encountered that afternoon flew with a fluid, almost instinctive coordination that shifted constantly in response to any incoming threat, transforming textbook attack patterns into dangerous gambles that rarely played out as intended. Their formation flexed and compressed in ways that rendered shallow diving angles useless, forcing approaching fighters into unpredictable slipstreams that battered their aircraft before they could even line up a proper shot. He described how the bomber's gunners displayed an unnerving awareness of movement within the sky, reacting far quicker than the training films had suggested, often tracking fighters long before they reached the recommended engagement distance. This awareness overwhelmed the assumption that American pilots could safely approach from above and behind, because the slightest adjustment in the bomber's altitude or bearing created overlapping arcs of fire that punished anyone attempting a conventional intercept. The manuals never acknowledged that the pressure of real combat compressed time into frantic bursts of decision-making, leaving pilots with only seconds to adapt before streams of defensive fire forced them into evasive maneuvers that shattered formation integrity. The pilot emphasized that the theory behind maintaining strict formation collapsed the moment the first burst of enemy fire scattered his squadron, leaving him with neither the spacing nor visual clarity required to apply the methods he had been taught. Without wingmen holding stable positions, the carefully constructed geometry of the standard attack dissolved into a chaotic swirl of isolated aircraft, struggling to avoid collision while still tracking the tightening bomber cluster. Every shift in the bomber's alignment created new blind spots and new threats, overwhelming the structured approach the manuals insisted would keep the pilots safe. He went on to explain that the Pacific weather itself played a role in undermining the effectiveness of the doctrine, because rising thermals and uneven cloud cover disrupted altitude management far more severely than his instructors had ever admitted. During the engagement, sudden gusts pushed his fighter downward, just as the bombers adjusted their own altitude, drawing him into a far steeper angle than Doctrine allowed, and leaving him exposed to fire from multiple gun positions simultaneously. The manuals treated the sky as a stable classroom, yet the reality was a shifting landscape where every pocket of turbulence carried the potential to wreck even the most carefully executed maneuver. The pilot noted that the biggest flaw in the Doctrine lay in its assumption that pilots would always have enough time and space to disengage safely when their aircraft sustained significant structural damage. He explained that once the first burst tore open his fuselage, the stability of his fighter deteriorated instantly, forcing him to compensate for uneven drag and sluggish roll response, while still evading incoming tracers. The idea of breaking away cleanly became a distant fantasy because each evasive dive risked losing sight of the bombers entirely, and losing sight meant abandoning the outpost below to whatever destruction the enemy intended. Finally, he acknowledged that the manuals never accounted for the psychological pressure of watching the bombers advance steadily toward American positions, knowing that every second lost brought the airfield closer to catastrophe. The urgency he felt in that moment overwhelmed the calculated patience the Doctrine demanded, replacing it with a fierce clarity that told him the standard methods would fail long before he could reposition for a safer attack. The decision he faced was brutally simple: follow the rules and watch the bombers reach their target, or break them completely, and attempt something no instructor would ever approve. As he concluded this part of his story, the crew surrounding him understood that the manuals had not failed because they were poorly written, but because they had been written for a world that no longer existed. In the unforgiving sky above the Pacific, reality had rewritten the rules long before anyone realized, leaving the young pilot with only instinct, desperation, and a rapidly closing window in which to act. The pilot explained that the crisis reached its sharpest point during a single, terrifying stretch of seconds when the enemy formation shifted unexpectedly, forcing him into a position far more dangerous than anything he had encountered in training or combat. He recalled how the nearest bomber abruptly dipped its left wing, creating a downward swell of turbulent air that slammed against his fighter's nose and sent the entire airframe shuddering with a violence that rattled the stick from his grip. As the aircraft lurched sideways, a burst of defensive fire streaked past the canopy, carving thin, glowing lines across his peripheral vision, and reminding him how narrowly he had escaped being torn apart by the opening volley. He described how the sudden jolt caused several warning lights to flicker across his panel, though he lacked the time to read any of them, as the cockpit filled with the harsh metallic smell of overheated components. The turbulence continued to buffet the aircraft as he fought to regain control, each impact shaking the seat beneath him and amplifying the unnerving sensation that the damaged fuselage might give way under the strain. He glanced briefly toward his left wing and caught sight of a thin trail of smoke spiraling upward from the torn metal, confirming that the earlier hit had created both structural instability and a slow-burning threat he could do nothing about. The pilot recounted how the radio erupted with frantic updates from his squadron, yet every transmission overlapped into a tangled stream of shouted warnings, lost bearings, and desperate calls for anyone still able to form a defensive line. Their voices blended into a rising wave of tension that only intensified the pressure, already squeezing his chest as he attempted to stabilize his fighter against forces he could barely anticipate. He finally recognized his wingman's voice, cutting through the noise long enough to warn him that two escorts were diving from high altitude, their approach angles placing them directly behind him with almost no room for an evasive maneuver. He remembered how the moment stretched unnaturally as he checked his rear mirror, witnessing the faint but unmistakable silhouettes of enemy fighters glinting in the sunlight as they accelerated toward him. The knowledge that he was seconds from being bracketed by converging lines of fire created a heavy, almost suffocating dread, forcing him to acknowledge that any slight hesitation would ensure immediate destruction. He tightened his grip on the control stick and attempted a shallow banking turn, yet the damaged fuselage resisted the movement, responding sluggishly as if the aircraft itself were fighting against his commands. The pilot explained how a sudden flash erupted to his right when another American fighter disintegrated under concentrated gunfire, scattering debris across the sky in a chaotic spray that nearly collided with his own turbulent flight path. He instinctively pulled up to avoid the drifting fragments, but the maneuver pushed him dangerously close to the center of the bomber formation, where the overlapping arcs of machine gun fire formed a lethal net capable of annihilating even an undamaged aircraft. The manuals had warned repeatedly against entering such a zone, yet the chaos surrounding him left no alternative route that offered even a moment's safety or clarity. He recounted the distinct moment when a sharp metallic clang reverberated through the cockpit after a fragment struck the underside of the fuselage, causing the floor panel beneath his boots to vibrate with a hollow, unsettling echo. The impact forced him to confront the grim reality that the next hit might compromise the fuel line, rupture the control cables, or ignite the smoldering damage along his left wing. The airframe trembled unevenly as he attempted another evasive roll, and he felt the stick momentarily resist before finally yielding to his determined pull. By the time he finished describing these harrowing seconds, everyone gathered around the damaged aircraft understood how precariously the young pilot's fate had hung in the balance. The micro-crisis he faced was not a single moment of danger, but a rapid cascade of overlapping threats that stripped away every illusion of safety offered by the manuals. It was within that collapsing window of survival that he realized no standard maneuver would save him, and unless he chose something drastic immediately, the sky itself would close around him with lethal certainty. The pilot explained that the decisive moment arrived when he recognized that every conventional option had collapsed, leaving only a narrow, rapidly closing path that no instructor would have dared suggest during training. He recalled how the bomber formation shifted into a dense cluster above him, their shadows darkening the fractured canopy while the escorts continued to descend from behind with perfect predatory precision. The manuals insisted that engaging from beneath a bomber group was suicidal, yet the sky around him offered no safer direction, and the growing roar of enemy engines urged him toward a choice that felt both reckless and inevitable. He described gripping the control stick with renewed resolve, forcing his damaged fighter into a steep upward angle that placed him directly beneath the center of the Japanese formation, where overlapping slipstreams battered the fragile airframe and threatened to tear the wings from their mounts. The turbulence intensified immediately, shaking the cockpit with enough violence to blur his vision and send loose debris rattling across the instrument panel. Every instinct conditioned by training urged him to abort the climb, but the encroaching escorts left no time for reconsideration as they dove toward his position with deadly accuracy. The pilot explained that his plan hinged on a maneuver forbidden in every pre-war manual, a rapid negative G push designed to drop him beneath the bomber's blind zone before catapulting upward into their vulnerable underbellies. He remembered exhaling sharply to brace his body against the sudden shift in gravitational force as he forced the nose downward, feeling the belt straps tighten across his shoulders while the horizon tilted violently outside the canopy. The aircraft responded sluggishly at first, due to the structural damage, yet he persisted with unwavering determination until the fighter broke through the turbulent pocket and descended into the narrow corridor directly under the bombers. He recounted how the sudden drop caused his stomach to lurch and his vision to waver, but the maneuver successfully carried him below the arcs of defensive fire that had previously pinned him in place. The gunners aboard the bombers struggled to track his abrupt shift in position, their weapons swiveling frantically as they fired bursts that passed harmlessly above his canopy. For a brief but critical instant, the intense chaos of the battlefield fell away, replaced by a surreal stillness as he aligned the nose of his fighter with the exposed engine compartments of the nearest bomber. The pilot squeezed the trigger, unleashing a controlled burst that tore through the bomber's undercarriage and ignited its fuel tank in a violent flash that illuminated the underside of the formation. Shrapnel and debris scattered downward as the stricken aircraft lurched sideways, its damaged wing colliding with the bomber beside it and causing both to pitch erratically as they fell from the sky. He used the resulting gap in the formation to position himself for another upward strike, accelerating through the turbulent slipstream despite the alarming creaks resonating from his wounded fuselage. He described executing a rapid roll to avoid the collapsing wreckage, while simultaneously lining up a second target, recognizing that each bomber he eliminated created fresh chaos among the escorts, desperately trying to regain control of the disintegrating formation. The sudden disruption he introduced spread like a shockwave through the enemy ranks, severing their once perfect coordination and forcing them into reactive patterns ill-suited to counter such an unorthodox attack. He recalled how the sight of bombers spiraling apart above him strengthened his resolve, confirming that his rule-breaking maneuver had not only bought him a chance to survive, but also opened the first real opportunity to turn the tide of the engagement. By the time he finished describing the sequence, the crew surrounding him understood that the move he executed was not simply bold, but astonishingly precise for a damaged fighter operating under overwhelming pressure. It defied every principle he had been taught, yet it succeeded because the manuals could not predict a pilot willing to challenge doctrine in the face of certain defeat. In that impossible moment, he chose to trust the raw instinct that demanded action over caution, and that choice became the spark that ignited the chain of events leading to the destruction of 7 enemy bombers in just 25 minutes. The pilot explained that the most revealing part of the battle emerged not from his own perspective, but from the fragmented glimpses he caught of the Japanese reaction, as his maneuver shattered the formation's illusion of control, creating ripples of confusion that spread through their ranks faster than any gunfire he had delivered. He remembered seeing one bomber's dorsal gunner swivel frantically toward empty sky, repeatedly firing at a threat that no longer occupied the angle he expected, his movements jerky and panicked, as though his instincts refused to accept that an American fighter had slipped beneath their meticulously defended perimeter. The pilot knew that such disorientation rarely appeared among experienced Japanese crews, whose discipline normally produced precise and coordinated responses, yet the sudden collapse of their firing arcs left them momentarily unable to establish even the simplest line of defense. He described how one escort fighter banked sharply across his field of vision, its pilot craning his neck toward the burning bomber, as if unsure how the attack had originated. The abrupt deviation disrupting the otherwise perfect symmetry of the escort screen that had earlier hemmed the Americans in with terrifying efficiency. The escort pilot fired a short burst into the space below him, clearly guessing rather than targeting, and the hesitation in his aim revealed how deeply the unexpected maneuver had fractured their confidence. Moments later, another escort overshot its intended path and drifted into a hazardous position between 2 bombers, forcing both gunners to cease fire for fear of accidentally striking their own aircraft. The pilot emphasized that these small cracks in coordination reflected a far greater shift occurring within the Japanese formation, because their doctrine relied heavily on maintaining cohesion, even under sudden pressure, and the disappearance of a single bomber could disrupt that cohesion only temporarily. However, the abrupt loss of 2 aircraft within seconds, combined with the high-speed confusion caused by his unconventional approach, undermined their training in ways no American pilot had previously forced them to confront. He recalled seeing several gunners rotate their turrets too quickly, overshooting their intended sectors and leaving brief blind spots that widened the moment additional turbulences shook the formation. The precision that usually characterized Japanese gunnery dissolved into a scattered series of reactive movements driven more by fear than calculation. He continued by explaining that the bomber's pilots attempted to stabilize the formation through tight, synchronized adjustments, yet these corrections inadvertently exposed new vulnerabilities, as aircraft struggled to maintain spacing while avoiding the debris still tumbling through the air. One bomber pitched too far right, forcing the adjacent aircraft to climb slightly, which in turn created a momentary gap that allowed sunlight to pierce through the formation and reveal its destabilized structure with startling clarity. In that widened seam, he recognized both the panic spreading among the Japanese crews and the rare opportunity created by their unraveling discipline. The pilot also described the visual chaos erupting within the formation as several gunners abandoned their usual calm precision, firing wildly at shifting shadows that no longer represented meaningful threats, their tracers stitching erratic paths across the sky in a desperate attempt to regain control of a battle that had already slipped beyond their grasp. He recalled watching a bomber gunner jerk his turret toward an empty cloud bank, likely misinterpreting a glint of sunlight as the return of the American fighter, and the misplaced volley signaled to the rest of the crew that their coordinated defense had fractured entirely. Such panic spread quickly when unsupported by stable leadership, and the collapse of a single gunner's composure often triggered broader miscalculations among the remaining defensive positions. He described noticing a final telling detail, as one escort fighter attempted to re-establish dominance by diving aggressively toward the gap below the formation, only to pull out abruptly when the pilot realized he had misjudged the American's vector. The escort's sudden retreat, marked by a plume of exhaust and a sharp banking turn, demonstrated that even seasoned Japanese pilots were struggling to interpret the new angles created by the unconventional American attack. Their training had prepared them for disciplined, predictable threats, not for a damaged fighter willing to exploit blind zones with both speed and audacity. By the time he concluded this part of his account, the crew listening on the runway understood that the Japanese pilots had not simply been surprised they had been destabilized at a fundamental tactical level. Their disbelief stemmed not from the loss of individual aircraft, but from the realization that a lone American fighter had broken the carefully engineered geometry that protected their formation. In those disordered seconds, the Japanese crews witnessed something they could neither anticipate nor replicate, and the shock of that revelation lingered long after the smoke trails began to fall toward the sea. The pilot explained that once the formation fractured, the rhythm of the battle shifted into a strange, accelerating tempo that seemed to pull him forward with an urgency he could neither resist nor fully comprehend, driving him toward each new target with a clarity that cut through the surrounding chaos like a sharpened blade. He described how the first bomber's fiery descent created a widening gap in the formation, exposing the vulnerable underbelly of the aircraft directly ahead, its engines glowing faintly in the filtered sunlight as the wounded fighter surged upward through turbulent air to line up another precise burst. The moment his guns roared again, he felt the aircraft tremble with the recoil, yet the stream of tracers hit squarely beneath the bomber's wing, igniting a brief flash that signaled the second kill before the crew had time to recover from the first unexpected loss. He recounted how the remaining bombers attempted to tighten their spacing to counter the rapidly emerging threat, but their rushed correction only created overlapping slipstreams that shoved several aircraft off balance, forcing gunners to adjust their angles while struggling to maintain visual contact with his unpredictable flight path. Recognizing the instability spreading through their formation, he rolled sharply to the right and pulled into a climbing turn that brought him alongside the third bomber's engine, cowling, its metallic surface shimmering in the fractured sunlight. A short, disciplined volley tore into the exposed compartment, sending pieces of fractured metal spiraling outward as the engine erupted into a plume of smoke that trailed behind the disintegrating wing. The fourth bomber fell only moments later, toppled not by direct fire but by the cascading effect of its neighbor's destruction, which caused the pilot to veer abruptly into the path of the incoming debris. The already stressed formation twisted violently as the crew attempted to compensate, yet the sudden collision of turbulence and evasive maneuvering overwhelmed their ability to maintain control, and the bomber slid into a shallow downward spiral that left a dark ribbon of exhaust stretching behind it. He watched from below as the aircraft dipped further into the haze, its descent accelerating until it vanished into the distant Pacific without a single defensive burst fired in return. He explained that by the time he maneuvered back beneath the formation, the remaining bombers were barely maintaining cohesion, their once tight geometry reduced to scattered silhouettes, pacing unevenly through the sky as each crew struggled to determine where the unseen attacker would strike next. The pilot seized that hesitation by diving directly beneath the fifth bomber, hugging the narrow corridor where its gunners could not depress their guns low enough to track him. With practiced precision, he opened fire into the bomb bay doors, watching them buckle outward before a secondary flash consumed the lower half of the fuselage in a wave of smoke and shattered metal. The sixth bomber, shaken by the simultaneous explosions, attempted a desperate climb to escape the chaos, but the maneuver left its underside fully exposed as it lifted into the open sky. He angled upward and released another controlled burst, this time aiming for the starboard engine, which erupted in flames before the aircraft could complete its climb. The bomber tipped violently to one side, its remaining engine straining against the sudden imbalance as the aircraft rolled into a steep, uncontrolled dive that left a swirling trail of smoke behind it. He noted that the seventh and final bomber required the most precise timing, because the remaining escorts had finally regained enough composure to begin repositioning for an intercept, forcing him to weave through converging arcs of fire while maintaining a steady lock on the weaving target. The bomber attempted to descend toward cloud cover, banking sharply in a last attempt to break contact. Yet the damaged fighter clung stubbornly to its trajectory, matching each shift with instinctive adjustments learned not from manuals, but from raw survival. When the opportunity finally opened, he pressed the trigger one last time, releasing a burst that stitched a clean line of sparks across the bomber's wing root before the entire structure folded inward under its own weight. By the time the seventh bomber fell from the sky, the remaining Japanese escorts were too scattered and disorganized to mount a meaningful counterattack, their formation shattered beyond recovery by the rapid, unrelenting sequence of kills. The pilot emphasized that he felt no triumph in those minutes, only an intense, focused determination that pushed him beyond exhaustion as he guided his damaged fighter through the drifting debris that marked the end of the engagement. And as he turned away from the smoke-filled sky, he understood that the astonishing outcome had not been the result of luck or flawless technique, but of a single decision to abandon the rules when they no longer offered a path to survival. The pilot explained that the aftermath of the engagement revealed its significance far more clearly than anything he had understood during those frantic minutes in the sky, because once the seventh bomber vanished into the distant haze, the entire Japanese strike plan collapsed before it could reach the American outpost. He described how the escorts, still reeling from the sudden loss of coordinated leadership, attempted a half-formed retreat that lacked the discipline usually associated with their units, scattering across the upper air currents in a disorganized pattern that signaled both exhaustion and uncertainty. Their withdrawal created an unexpected stillness across the battlefield, allowing the pilot to survey the fading smoke trails and fully grasp how dramatically the threat had been neutralized despite the overwhelming odds he had faced only minutes earlier. He recounted how the radio slowly cleared of chaotic transmissions as surviving members of his squadron regrouped at a safe distance, their voices carrying a mixture of disbelief and relief that underscored the magnitude of what had just occurred. Several pilots admitted they had assumed the outpost would suffer catastrophic damage once the bomber formation slipped past their initial intercept line, yet the sudden eradication of the strike force spared the base from what would have been a devastating assault. The fuel depots, command tents, and communication arrays scattered across the island remained untouched, their survival owed entirely to a maneuver that no training syllabus would have endorsed. He explained that the returning American patrols quickly identified the absence of secondary Japanese waves, confirming that the destroyed formation represented the primary offensive effort for that afternoon, and its elimination forced the enemy to abandon the larger operational plan tied to the strike. This disruption had immediate implications for the regional conflict, because Japanese commanders rarely committed bombers without broader coordination, meaning the defeat effectively severed a key link in their campaign for air dominance. The failure to deliver the expected blow placed the Japanese units on the defensive for the remainder of the week, granting American forces a rare interval of breathing room to repair damaged aircraft, replenish ammunition supplies, and reinforce early warning protocols across the island. The pilot noted that intelligence officers conducted rapid debriefings soon after his return, piecing together fragments of radio intercepts and visual reports to understand how a single engagement had altered the operational landscape. Analysts determined that the combination of destroyed bombers, scattered escorts, and disrupted timing forced the Japanese command to cancel a planned follow-up raid that had been intended to cripple the airstrip before reinforcements could arrive. This cancellation effectively safeguarded the island's defensive infrastructure, preserving the runway and maintenance facilities that would play essential roles in supporting future American operations in the region. He emphasized that the strategic shift was not limited to physical outcomes, because the psychological effect on both sides rippled beyond the immediate aftermath. American crews gained a renewed sense of confidence as word spread through the squadrons that a single pilot had dismantled an entire enemy strike group, proving that unconventional tactics could succeed even when Doctrine insisted otherwise. Mechanics, gunners, and rookies who had previously viewed Japanese bomber formations as nearly untouchable now possessed a living example of vulnerability they could study and internalize during subsequent training cycles. This morale boost strengthened the collective resolve of the outpost at a moment when uncertainty had threatened to undermine its defensive posture. At the same time, he explained that Japanese records later revealed signs of deep confusion among the surviving air crews, whose after-action reports described the American fighters' maneuver as reckless, unpredictable, and nearly impossible to counter using established defensive drills. Their inability to contain a damaged aircraft that operated outside expected engagement patterns forced them to reassess their assumptions regarding American pilot behavior, introducing an element of caution that subtly eroded the boldness with which they typically executed raid operations. This shift in perception, though minor in appearance, would gradually dilute the aggressiveness that had previously given Japanese formations an upper hand during early war encounters. By the time he concluded his explanation, it was clear to everyone listening that the engagement had reshaped more than a single afternoon's battle. It had altered the tactical rhythm of the region in ways both immediate and far-reaching. The destruction of the 7 bombers not only saved the outpost from certain damage, but also disrupted enemy planning, bolstered American morale, and forced the Japanese to reconsider assumptions that had previously guided their combat strategies. And all of it had begun with a maneuver that no instructor would have dared teach, executed by a pilot who refused to let Doctrine dictate the limits of survival. The pilot grew noticeably quieter as he shifted from explaining tactical consequences to recalling the private emotions that flooded him once the final bomber disappeared beneath the horizon, because the silence that followed the engagement carried a weight far heavier than the smoke trails still lingering across the sea. He described how the adrenaline that had guided every instinct began to fade the moment he broke away from the battlefield, leaving his arms trembling on the control stick as the damaged fighter drifted through settling air currents that no longer carried the thunder of engines or the crack of gunfire. The sudden calm felt unnervingly fragile, as though the sky itself was holding its breath, while allowing him a brief moment to acknowledge the cost of the choices he had made. He explained that, as he approached the island, each familiar landmark triggered flashes of faces he had seen earlier that morning. Rookie pilots tightening their gloves, mechanics wiping oil from their hands, and seasoned aviators offering quick nods before climbing into their cockpits, faces that might never have appeared before him again had the battle shifted even slightly in the enemy's favor. The realization that several of those men had not returned weighed heavily on him, pressing against his thoughts with a quiet, persistent ache that grew stronger with every mile closer to the runway. Although he had destroyed 7 bombers and broken a Japanese raid, he knew the victory came threaded with loss that no report or commendation could fully acknowledge. He remembered guiding the wounded fighter toward the airstrip, listening to the uneven hum of the failing engine as it struggled to maintain power during the final descent. The scent of burnt insulation still clung to the cockpit, mingling with the metallic tang of heated aluminum, and each reminder of the battle pulled him deeper into the sobering knowledge that his survival had hinged on moments so thin they bordered on impossible. When his wheels finally touched the ground, he felt a ripple of relief that spread through him like a quiet sigh, though beneath it lingered the heavy truth that the return of one aircraft did not erase the missing shadows of those that hadn't followed. The pilot described stepping onto the runway with knees that wavered slightly under the strain of exhaustion, his boots meeting the warm earth with a sense of finality that contrasted sharply with the chaos he had fled only minutes earlier. The mechanics who surrounded his aircraft spoke in hushed tones at first, their eyes darting between the ruined fuselage and the pilot's solemn expression, recognizing that this was not a moment for celebration but one for understanding the emotional toll hidden behind tactical success. As they examined the damage, he found himself tracing the torn metal with a gloved hand, feeling the jagged edges that had nearly ended his life long before the final bomber fell. He recounted how the flight commander approached quietly, offering a firm hand on his shoulder that carried more comfort than any words could provide. The commander's expression held a blend of pride and concern, acknowledging both the extraordinary skill displayed in the battle and the human vulnerability revealed in its aftermath. The pilot admitted that he struggled to meet the commander's eyes at first, burdened by the unanswered